64 years ago, in the soft blue quiet of a June morning in Athens, Ohio, Charlotte Moore vanished, slipping out of the world before anyone realized the day had even begun, leaving behind a devastated family and a town that would never again feel entirely safe. For a time, suspicion narrowed on someone close to her, a man whose calm exterior concealed decades of tension and shadowed history. But there was no body, no reliable evidence, and every lead fractured under scrutiny until the case was quietly archived, boxed, labeled, and placed on a high shelf as though the truth could simply be stored away. And yet, the truth was still out there. What no one knew then was that a strange object, something discovered in the present day, quietly and without ceremony, would force investigators to reopen everything the town tried to forget. But long before that moment, there was Charlotte herself, a gentle, reserved 27-year-old woman whose internal world was richer, more complex, and more burdened than anyone around her ever fully understood. The morning she disappeared had begun with the faint chirp of sparrows outside the narrow bedroom window of the small Maple Street home she shared with her mother. The house always carried a faint scent of lemon polish and old paper, the kind of aroma that settled into the grain of wooden floors over decades. Even now, 64 years later, the smell remains fixed in the memories of those who once crossed its threshold. On that day in 1961, the air was cool and brushed with the early heat rising off the hills surrounding Athens, a hint of humidity clinging to the light like damp silk. Charlotte rose early, as she always did, slipping her feet into worn slippers that whispered across the scuffed hardwood. Her life was a collection of routines, small, stable rituals she clung to after separating from her husband. She carried herself with a quiet, almost fragile composure, as though worried that one wrong step might crack the thin veneer holding her days together. Her mornings always began the same way. A kettle set on the stovetop, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, and the faint rustling of her mother turning pages of the newspaper at the kitchen table. She liked order. She liked predictability. But beneath the surface, concealed from everyone except perhaps herself, there were deeper currents, unspoken fears, private disappointments, the weight of a life that had not unfolded the way she once imagined it. Athens in the early 1960s was a town caught between the lingering calm of post-war America and the slow, inevitable shift toward a more complicated decade. Brick storefronts lined Court Street, windows bright with displays of local goods. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the metallic tang of passing coal trains. Life moved at a measured pace, steady, familiar, safe. At least on the surface, people remembered Charlotte as dependable, almost painfully polite, with a soft-spoken manner that made others instinctively lower their voices around her. She worked as an accounting secretary at a construction company, sorting invoices, ledger sheets, and payroll documents with meticulous precision. But work was not her refuge. It was something she endured, hour by hour, to keep the household afloat after the separation. She rarely spoke of her marriage. When she did, her voice hardly rose above a whisper. What no one saw, or perhaps chose not to see, were the signs of strain around her eyes. The long pauses when she thought she was alone. The way she sometimes pressed her fingertips to her temples as if holding something in place. These were the details that, in retrospect, would haunt her family. The subtle clues that something weighed heavily on her long before the day she disappeared. The weeks leading up to her disappearance were ordinary in the way that ordinary days sometimes carry quiet, invisible warning. There were small incidents, misplaced receipts at work, a night when she returned home later than usual, a neighbor who recalled seeing her pause at the end of the driveway one evening, as though deciding whether or not to get into a waiting car. None of it seemed meaningful at the time. Later, These fragments would be pored over with a devotion bordering on desperation. But on that June morning in 1961, Charlotte moved through her routine with gentle precision. Steam curled from her teacup. A beam of sunlight slipped across the kitchen floor, catching dust motes that drifted like tiny suspended worlds. Her mother would later recall the way Charlotte's hair glowed in that light, golden at the edges, as if she were fading, even then softening into the day that would take her from them by mid-morning. She stepped outside, the screen door creaking softly behind her, the air warm and thickening with summer's promise. She carried her work bag, pressed against her side like a shield. Neighbors later described seeing her walk down Maple Street, her posture straight, her pace unhurried. But something about her seemed distant, as though she were caught in a private, unreachable place. When she failed to arrive at work, at first, no one questioned it. People assumed she'd taken a rare personal day. But by evening, with no sign of her, no calls, no explanation, worry settled over the household like a darkening storm front, and then she was gone. Completely, irrevocably gone. In the years that followed, the early suspect, the one investigators quietly circled around, would remain a point of whispered speculation. He was familiar, trusted, someone woven into the fabric of Charlotte's life. But suspicion alone was never enough. Without evidence, without a body, the case slipped into shadow. Yet through all those decades, in basements, attics, and back rooms across Athens, people kept pieces of her memory alive, old photographs, stories, recollections of her voice, her careful manners, the soft click of her shoes on the sidewalk. Time eroded facts, but not presence. And then came the present day, the discovery. An unexpected object, unremarkable on its surface, but carrying an echo of 1961 so sharp it reopened the case with a jolt. Investigators would later describe the moment as a crack in time. A fault line that once disturbed could not be closed again. But before any of that, the evidence, the forensic breakthroughs, the unraveling, there is Charlotte. Her quiet longing, her unspoken fears, her final mourning frozen in the collective memory of a town that never stopped wondering what happened to her. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? The June morning that would one day be remembered as the beginning of an unending ache started like every other one in Charlotte Moore's life, quietly, deliberately, with rituals that anchored her to a world she often struggled to feel fully part of. Even before the sun climbed over the rolling hills of Athens, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to hold herself together from the inside out. Her bedroom on Maple Street was a small, neatly kept space where soft morning light filtered through lace curtains her mother had hemmed years earlier. The wallpaper, faded pastel florals, held the faint scent of old plaster and lavender sachets, placed in drawers to keep moths away. On her dresser sat a framed photograph of her and her younger sister as children, the edges worn from years of dusting. Charlotte always paused at that frame in the morning, sometimes tracing the outline of her childhood face with a gentle fingertip, as if remembering a version of herself that felt far removed from the life she lived now. Her separation from her husband had been quiet, without public drama or outward hostility, but it left a crack in her that never fully healed. She did not share the details, not even with her mother, but people sensed the heaviness in her. Something in her voice, soft, almost brittle around the consonants, suggested an exhaustion that sleep alone could not repair. Still, Charlotte built her days with structure. It was how she kept her world from unraveling. She rose every morning at 6:10 a.m. precisely, slipping out of bed before her mother's alarm sounded. She preferred solitude at dawn, the moments when the world felt suspended in stillness. The kettle warming on the stovetop filled the kitchen with a low hum, and she would stand near the window, palms wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood wake slowly. She liked the way the early light cast long shadows across the yard, the way the dew on the grass glimmered like a thin layer of frost. She found comfort in the predictability of each sunrise. Her mother often observed her from the kitchen table, quietly turning the pages of the newspaper. The older woman understood the fragility beneath Charlotte's calm exterior, but she did not pry. She let the silence unfold between them, soft and familiar. After breakfast, Charlotte prepared for work. Her clothing choices were always measured like blouses, modest skirts, neutral tones that blended into the polite expectations of her job. She moved carefully, smoothing fabric, aligning seams, choosing small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. These quiet preparations formed a kind of armor, one that allowed her to face the day without revealing the deeper anxieties she carried. At the construction company, where she worked as an accounting secretary, Charlotte's duties were steady and repetitive, reconciling invoices, updating ledger sheets, stamping documents for filing. It was the sort of work that suited a mind that needed order. Yet even there, amid the hum of typewriters and the shuffle of blueprints, she often drifted into long moments of inward reflection. Coworkers noticed that she would sometimes pause mid-task, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the window, as though listening for something that never arrived. She rarely joined colleagues for lunch, preferring instead to slip outside and sit beneath the large sycamore behind the building. She liked the texture of the bark rough, peeling in patches, and the way the leaves rustled in the summer breeze. She would close her eyes during those breaks, feeling the warmth of the sun against her face, imagining for a moment that the world was wider and safer than it often felt. At home, her evenings followed a different kind of rhythm. She helped her mother prepare dinner, the aroma of onions and simmering broth filling the narrow kitchen. After the meal, Charlotte often retreated to her room, lighting a small lamp on the bedside table. She kept a journal, though she seldom wrote more than a few lines. The entries were restrained, almost cryptic, brief notations about the weather, a thought that had unsettled her, a memory that surfaced when she least expected it. More than anything, she sought quiet. Quiet was where she could breathe. Yet beneath these routines, something stirred, an undercurrent of anxiety that grew stronger in the weeks before her disappearance. Her mother noticed the change first, the way Charlotte's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, the way she lingered by the front window in the evenings, scanning the street as though expecting someone, the way she startled at small noises, the creak of a floorboard, the distant clatter of a passing train. Even her room shifted subtly. A drawer that once held only letters now contained envelopes she kept carefully hidden. The small mirror above her dresser had smudges, as though she had touched its surface repeatedly while lost in thought. A single pair of shoes, normally stored neatly beneath the bed, was left near the window one morning, mud on the solace despite a week without rain. Charlotte's life was a tapestry woven from threads of quiet resilience, private longing, and understated sorrow. She wanted to rebuild herself after the separation, to find a sense of direction, but she felt caught between obligation and possibility, between who she was expected to be and who she wished she could become. Some evenings, she walked alone through her neighborhood, the warm glow of porch lights illuminating the sidewalks. She often paused at the edge of Maple Street, where the road curved gently toward the main square. She would stand there for a long time, listening to the distant hum of cars, the faint laughter spilling from a nearby porch, the rhythmic chirping of crickets rising from the grass. It was as if she were silently debating whether to continue forward or turn back. These walks left her with a mixture of calm and unease, and emotional residue she carried home with her. She was a woman of quiet endurance, but she was also deeply human. She longed for stability, for tenderness, for a life that did not feel like a fragile balancing act. She feared becoming invisible, Yet she also feared being seen too clearly. Her inner world was a landscape of private contradictions, gentle hopes, shadowed by old wounds. And in the last days before she vanished, those inner tensions grew sharper, as though the horizon of her life was shifting in ways she could not yet name. In the final days before Charlotte Moore vanished, her world seemed to contract into a series of moments that, while ordinary on the surface, carried a weight that would only be understood in hindsight. These days were marked by subtle changes, quiet ruptures, in her routine that hinted at an encroaching shift she could neither articulate nor escape. It was as though time itself was tightening around her, compressing events into a narrow corridor leading toward a single, irrevocable point. The week began with heat settling over Athens, the kind that made early mornings feel heavy, even before the sun crested the horizon. On Maple Street, porch flags hung still, unmoved by wind. The cicadas droned with a relentless hum that filled the air like static. The sky often glowed with a faint golden haze, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the sidewalks. In her home, small inconsistencies emerged, signs of a mind preoccupied. Her mother noticed that Charlotte left the kitchen light on late into the night, something she never did. Her teacup appeared washed, but left out on the drying rack instead of being placed neatly in its cabinet. More tellingly, she was waking before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table long before her mother rose, staring into the soft light with an expression her mother later described as a blend of worry and determination. The final days revealed a tension within her that had become impossible to ignore. At work, coworkers observed that she seemed increasingly distracted. She misplaced ledgers she normally handled with meticulous care. She paused mid-sentence in conversations, her eyes drifting toward the door or the hallway, as though listening for something faint and far away. The hum of typewriters and the faint scent of blueprint ink seemed to fade from her awareness. One coworker recalled seeing her by the back office window, her hand lightly resting on the sill. She was staring at the gravel lot behind the building, watching as a car idled for several minutes before pulling away. She remained there long after the car disappeared, her posture tense, her shoulders drawn in slightly. No one asked her about it at the time. It seemed too personal, too easily misinterpreted as a moment of quiet reflection rather than concern. On Tuesday evening, she returned home later than usual. Her mother, sitting in the living room where the warm glow of a floor lamp spilled across the floral carpet, looked up when Charlotte entered. Her blouse was slightly wrinkled, her hair unsettled by a breeze that hadn't existed on Maple Street that day. Her shoes were dusty. She offered no explanation. She simply moved past her mother, murmuring that she was tired, and retreated to her room. That night, she opened her journal again. The entry was short, no more than a few words, written with a heaviness that pressed the ink deeper into the page. Those words would later be examined under the harsh fluorescent lights of an evidence room. Magnified and photographed, though their meaning remained elusive. By midweek, Charlotte seemed to waver between periods of intense focus and moments of profound hesitation. She checked the mailbox multiple times in a single evening. She stepped outside as though expecting someone, only to retreat moments later. Her mother watched from the window, the concern in her eyes deepening. The weather on the eve of her disappearance turned oddly stagnant. Clouds hovered low and unmoving, creating a dim, filtered light that washed the world in muted tones. Charlotte walked home that evening with her work bag clutched tightly against her side. She passed familiar landmarks, the church with its tall steeple, the row of mailboxes near the elementary school, corner grocery where the scent of produce drifted into the street. Every step carried a faint tremor of uncertainty. When she arrived home, something in her expression had changed. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like resignation, a quiet understanding that a shift was coming. Her mother would later describe the look as the moment she knew something had settled over her daughter that could not be undone. That night, Charlotte barely touched her dinner. She excused herself early and retreated to her room. Her mother, passing by later, noticed a sliver of light beneath the door and the shadow of her daughter seated at the edge of the bed, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in her lap. She looked like she was bracing herself in those last hours. Charlotte moved with a slow deliberateness, as though each motion carried meaning. She set out her work clothes for the next morning. She arranged her bag on the chair by the window. She placed her grandmother's pearl earrings on the dresser instead of in their usual dish. She opened her window a few inches to let in the warm night air, carrying the distant hum of passing cars and the soft rustle of leaves. And then there was the moment, the quiet one, that investigators would later fixate on. A neighbor saw Charlotte standing at the end of her driveway just before midnight, her silhouette faint beneath the dim yellow wash of the street lamp. She stood completely still, as though waiting for something only she could sense. The neighbor thought she might be getting air, perhaps unable to sleep in the warm, heavy night. It seemed harmless at the time. It would become the last confirmed sighting of her. The final day, June 14th, 1961, began with a strange stillness. The dawn was pale, the light thin and diffused through a lingering morning haze. Charlotte dressed for work, smoothing the fabric of her blouse with trembling hands. She moved through her routine quietly, almost reverently, the steps feeling heavy and inevitable. She brewed tea but did not drink it. She packed her work bag but hesitated before closing it. She paused by the window, looking out at the street where the sycamore leaves flickered gently in the early breeze. Her mother noticed a tremor in her voice when she said she would see her later. And then she stepped out the door. Her figure moved down Maple Street, dissolving slowly into the soft morning light. Each step part of a narrative no one yet understood. Her absence would be noticed before noon. Her vanishing would ripple through Athens before nightfall. But in those last moments, she was simply a woman walking toward the day, ahead toward an unseen fracture that would break the story of her life in two. Subscribe for more true crime stories like this. The morning of June 14th, 1961, began without spectacle, no storms, no sudden shifts in weather. Nothing that might have warned anyone in Athens that the day would soon carve a fault line through the town's collective memory. The sky was pale and washed out, as though the color had been drained from it overnight. The air carried the quiet heaviness of mid-June, warm but not oppressive, threaded with the faint scent of cut grass drifting from lawns up and down Maple Street. Charlotte Moore walked into that morning with a measured gait, her work bag held close, the hem of her skirt brushing softly against her legs. Neighbors would later recall that she looked unusually pale. Some said she appeared lost in thought, her eyes fixed on something ahead of her that they themselves could not see. Others remembered the slight stiffness in her posture, as though her body was bracing for something her mind could not fully name. Every detail from that morning would be documented, re-examined, and reconstructed with forensic precision in the decades that followed. Yet most of it remained impressions, memories softened by time and regret. At 7:32 a.m., she was seen at the corner of Maple Street and College Avenue, waiting for the pedestrian light to change. The slow blink of the signal reflected faintly on her skin. A light breeze carried the scent of warm asphalt and the distant sound of a delivery truck backing into the alley behind a bakery. She clutched the strap of her work bag tighter than usual, her fingers whitening at the knuckles. This was the last moment anyone could place her with certainty. The timeline after that point fractured into speculation, fragments, and witness accounts that contradicted one another or dissolved under scrutiny. What is known is that she never arrived at the construction office where she worked. Her desk remained untouched, ledger sheets stacked neatly, her pencils sharpened and aligned. A colleague noticed that her chair, usually pulled slightly forward, remained tucked tightly beneath the desk. By early afternoon, concern set in. Not panic, just a quiet, uneasy question that circled through her workplace and made its way home. Her mother waited by the front window, the lace curtain pinched between two fingers, eyes scanning for Charlotte's familiar silhouette. She watched as the sunlight shifted across the walkway, lengthening shadows. She watched as the neighborhood moved through its routines, children on bicycles, a mailman making his rounds. The sound of a radio drifting faintly from a nearby porch. Charlotte did not return. Around 6 p.m., her mother walked to the corner of the street, calling her daughter's name into the still air. The sky had deepened to a soft, muted gold, the sun lowering behind the hills. A neighbor emerged to ask what she was looking for. Another joined. The concern spread slowly, like a ripple across calm water. By nightfall, the Moore home had become a small command post, a place where neighbors gathered on the porch with flashlights, where voices murmured in low tones, where the smell of brewed coffee mingled with the warm scent of summer night air. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling gently in her lap, listening to the shifting creaks of the house as if expecting her daughter to walk through the door at any moment. The first officers arrived shortly after 9 p.m. They asked simple questions at first. When was the last time you saw her? Did she say anything unusual? Did she have any conflicts at work? Their notes were neat, methodical, precise. They walked through the house quietly, their shoes making faint, hollow sounds on the wood floors. They examined her room with gloved hands, noting the bed neatly made, the journal closed, the pearl earrings still resting on the dresser. One officer paused by the window. It was still opened slightly, letting in the warm scent of honeysuckle from the yard. He made a note of it. As the investigation unfolded over the next hours, the timeline became a lattice of uncertainty. A woman claimed she saw Charlotte near the bus station around 8 a.m., though she was not entirely sure. A store clerk thought he recognized her in the hardware aisle of a local shop, holding a folded slip of paper. A truck driver reported seeing a woman resembling her along Route 56, walking quickly as though late for something. None of these sightings were confirmed. The most troubling detail came from a neighbor, who remembered seeing a dark-colored car idling near the corner of Maple Street that morning. It was early, closer to 7:20 a.m., and the car was unfamiliar. The neighbor recalled that the engine ran quietly, barely audible, but the posture of the driver leaning slightly forward, hands tight on the wheel, struck him as odd. When investigators followed up, the description proved too vague to trace. By midnight, search teams fanned out through the surrounding woods and streets. Flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, sweeping across tree trunks, overgrown brush, and the edges of the creek that wound through the nearby park. The air was thick with humidity, and the sound of nocturnal insects rose in a steady chorus. Her name carried through the darkness in soft, urgent calls. But the darkness gave nothing back. As the early morning hours crept forward, the investigation shifted its focus toward anyone who had been part of Charlotte's life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One name appeared early, a familiar figure, someone woven into her personal history, someone whose proximity made investigators pause. He had reason to maintain a calm facade. He also had reason to hide fractures beneath it. But the evidence was thin. There were no signs of a struggle, no note, no witnesses who could identify a decisive moment when her path diverted from routine into danger. Only a timeline that simply stopped. The next day, her belongings were cataloged, the contents of her work bag still organized, her desk untouched, her room unchanged. Her mother kept returning to the front door, opening it as though she might find her daughter on the porch, hesitant and apologetic, explaining everything, but the silence persisted, and the disappearance unexpected. Immaculate in its lack of trace, settled like a cold weight over Athens. altering the texture of life there in ways that would only deepen as days turned into years. The first days of the investigation unfolded under a blanket of rising dread, the kind that settles quietly but firmly over a small town unprepared for a disappearance without answers. Athens, Ohio, accustomed to predictable rhythms, to familiar faces moving through well-trodden routines, found itself suddenly thrust into a narrative that felt foreign, disorienting, and profoundly destabilizing. What began as concern sharpened into fear as each hour passed without any sign of Charlotte. More. On June 15, 1961. Search operations expanded with a precision shaped as much by desperation as by procedure. Officers from the local department coordinated with sheriff's deputies, volunteers, and members of the Ohio University community. Maps unfurled across tabletops in the station, thick red pencil lines circling wooded areas, utility sheds, ravines, abandoned structures, and stretches of road leading toward the rural outskirts. The dull sound of pushpins sliding into cork echoed through the room as search zones grew wider. The air that morning was thick with summer humidity. Clouds drifted low, diffusing sunlight into a muted grayish glow that clung to the town streets. Volunteers gathered outside the Moore residence, their boots sinking into damp soil as they prepared to fan out into the nearby woods. They carried flashlights, even though daylight still lingered. They carried ropes, gloves, and filed radios borrowed from campus security. Their voices remained low, weighted by the gravity of their task. Inside the Moore home, officers worked quietly through the rooms, photographing each space before touching anything. The house felt almost suspended in time. Teacup on the counter, neatly folded linens on a chair, the smell of lemon polish faint beneath the heavier scent of too many people moving through a once private space. Charlotte's mother sat at the kitchen table, her shoulders trembling softly under the weight of questions that seemed impossible to answer. On Charlotte's bed, her floral patterned coverlet was smoothed flat, untouched since the morning she vanished. Investigators sifted through her belongings with gloved hands, documenting each item. A half-used bottle of hand cream, a small stack of letters tied with twine, the journal that ended abruptly days earlier. They noted the window still slightly open, a detail that produced no immediate insights but no shortage of speculation. For the first 48 hours, the community mobilized with urgency. Men walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, brushing through waist-high grass. Women organized food and water stations for volunteers. Teenagers who barely knew Charlotte offered to search creeks, drainage ditches, and abandoned barns. The sound of two-way radios crackled across the landscape. The constant snapping of branches underfoot punctuated the otherwise oppressive silence. Despite the scale of the effort, no clothing, belongings, or footprints were recovered. Not a single piece of physical evidence tied the landscape to her disappearance. Early leads that emerged slipped quickly through investigators' fingers. A store clerk reported seeing a woman resembling Charlotte around mid-morning on the day she vanished. But surveillance technology did not exist in any local shops. Her description, vague and uncertain, dissolved under questioning. A bus driver thought he recognized her near the depot, but the timeline contradicted the last confirmed sighting at Maple and College. His recollection replayed so many times, he eventually doubted himself faded from the record without providing direction. The dark-colored car spotted idling near. Her streak remained the most promising lead. But descriptions contradicted each other. Some said it was a sedan, others a coupe. Some reported it was navy, others black. Some remembered a single occupant, others two. The ambiguity left investigators in a haze of possibilities without traction. Officers circled repeatedly around one individual, a man from her personal orbit, whose connection to her past gave his name a certain gravity. His demeanor raised questions, particularly his calmness and certainty that she would turn up soon. He offered answers that felt practiced, almost script-like. But calm was not illegal. Familiarity was not evidence. And without tangible proof, investigators were forced to tread carefully. Within days, media attention intensified. Newspaper reporters stationed themselves outside the Moore residence, their cameras clicking softly whenever the front door opened. Headlines used phrases like mystery, vanishing, and unanswered questions. The Athens Messenger ran a front-page story capturing the town's unease. With each article, rumors proliferated, stories spreading through diners, barbershops, and church gatherings. People speculated about strangers passing through town, about unsettled debts, about the lingering tension from her marriage. But beneath the speculation was a quieter, more intimate grief. Residents who had known Charlotte for years found themselves retracing every memory: her soft voice, her polite nod in the grocery aisle, the careful way she greeted neighbors while carrying her work ledgers home. She had been part of the gentle architecture of Athens, and her disappearance felt like a piece of the town had been silently removed. By the end of the first week, fatigue set in. Volunteers stumbled home with sore feet, their optimism dimmed. Officers reviewed maps already combed, wondering what they had missed. Charlotte's mother barely slept. She sat in the living room most nights, the lamp casting a single circle of warm light across the floor as she listened to the sounds of a house too quiet. Inside the police station, the investigation board expanded. Photographs of Charlotte, her gentle expression frozen in time, were pinned at the center. Lines of string extended outward to names, locations, timelines. A large map of Athens hung nearby, colored with pinheads marking every reported sighting, lead, and search sweep. The board grew more complex by the day, but not more conclusive. Procedural missteps, small, subtle, but cumulatively damaging, began to surface. Witness statements were taken hours too late. The area where the dark car had been seen was not canvassed thoroughly until the third day. Items in Charlotte's room were handled in an order that complicated later chain of custody reviews. These errors did not break the case, but they undermined the foundation upon which early efforts depended. As the second week ended, hope shifted into a quieter, more desperate form. No longer a belief she might return home, but a need to understand what happened. Families in Athens locked their doors earlier. Parents kept children closer. Night walks, once a common pastime, dwindled to nothing. The crime, the moment itself, remained invisible, hidden somewhere in the hours between her last confirmed step on Maple Street and the town's realization she was gone. But its impact widened each day, tightening around lives that had once felt untouched by tragedy. The investigation had begun, but already cracks were forming, cracks through which the truth would slip for decades. Like this story? Tap the like button to support more true crime investigations. Months passed, and Charlotte Moore's disappearance slowly morphed from urgent investigation into a cold case, though the ache in Athens never softened. Evidence, sparse from the start, became even more elusive. Witnesses' memories faded, timelines blurred, and the once vivid urgency of search parties was replaced by meticulous paperwork, filed and shelved, as if categorizing absence could conjure clarity. Officers rotated, retirements came, and the case settled into the archives marked unsolved, but never truly forgotten. The early leads had run dry. The mysterious dark car, the fleeting sightings near the bus depot, the neighbor's glimpse at the end of Maple Street, all had dissolved under scrutiny, leaving only fragments of suspicion. The man who had been tentatively circled remained uncharged. He continued his life in Athens, his presence a shadow that lingered uneasily in the town's memory, untouchable by law, yet heavy in collective imagination. People whispered, wondered, and sometimes outright avoided him, but nothing tangible emerged. Charlotte's mother lived in suspended grief. Her routines, once aligned with her daughter's, became hollow echoes. She prepared meals as though Charlotte might return, folded clothes for a child who would never arrive, and traced the morning light across the windowpane, remembering the way it had glimmered across her daughter's hair. She carried the weight of years in quiet silences, her body stooped, hands often pressed to her chest as though holding in the absence. Each small sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant whistle of a train reverberated like a reminder that Charlotte's presence had been erased. The town of Athens, too, carried scars. Local businesses left lights on later. Children were watched more closely, and community events were tempered by a subtle, unspoken anxiety. Her disappearance lingered in the background of everyday life, a quiet shadow shading the ordinary. The local police department maintained a folder on the case, neatly labeled but rarely opened. Protocols existed, but the human element, the urgent questioning of instinct, the hunches that sometimes crack a case, was dulled by the slow fade of memory and time. Artifacts remained, small yet potent, stored in evidence lockers. A single pearl earring, Charlotte's journal with its incomplete entries, photographs of her at the accounting office and on quiet Maple Street mornings. Each object carried a resonance beyond its physicality, a trace of her presence, a whisper of a life interrupted. Investigators who revisited these items described the sensation as almost tactile, the edges of photographs fraying under touch. Ink smudged in the journal, as though time itself had pressed against it. The earrings still warm in memory, even decades later. The emotional toll rippled through those who had been closest to her. Friends wondered what they might have missed, replaying conversations and encounters. Each memory, once comforting, became a source of scrutiny. They remembered the soft way she spoke, the tilt of her head when she smiled, the quiet care with which she treated people. These recollections, innocuous at first, transformed into fragments of a puzzle that had no solution. The heartache was cumulative, each anniversary sharpening rather than dulling the sense of lost dot as the years stretched into decades. The procedural history of the case grew more bureaucratic. Reports were digitized and refiled. Lead detectives retired. Newer officers approached the files with methodical detachment. Yet emotional undercurrents remained. The sense of injustice, the raw grief, the feeling that a life had been quietly erased. These were unquantifiable. Resisting filing cabinets and digital databases and then came whispers of a possible breakthrough. Not yet definitive, not yet connected to Charlotte in the public mind, but hints that modern methods might shine light into corners long ignored. A piece of evidence overlooked decades prior, re-examined with techniques unimaginable in 1961, had begun to surface. It was small, almost insignificant in isolation. A tiny fragment of paper, a faint impression, an object tucked in storage. But it carried the potential to reopen everything. Even the people who had long resigned themselves to Charlotte's absence felt a ripple of hope. Some, cautious and protective of fragile expectations, resisted optimism. Others allowed themselves brief imaginings of closure, the possibility of answers that had eluded them for generations. And always, in the background, lingered the question that haunted the case. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The cold case era was a study in patience and sorrow, in the grinding weight of unknowing. Yet even in its frozen state, it never stopped pressing against the lives it touched, demanding acknowledgement. Charlotte Moore's story, her presence, her absence, was no longer merely a series of lost moments. It had become a persistent, almost living force, awaiting the moment when truth would finally emerge from shadow. Decades after Charlotte Moore vanished, the quiet persistence of her memory collided with the steady advance of modern investigative techniques. A new detective, recently assigned to the Athens cold case unit, approached the file with a meticulous precision, untainted by decades of rumor and assumed conclusions. He did not know Charlotte personally, nor the intimate textures of grief that clung to her mother or the community. What he brought was time, technology, and a refusal to accept the past as immutable. The first breakthrough came from the archives. A small, overlooked object, once deemed insignificant, was retrieved from a locked storage cabinet. It was a scrap of paper, yellowed and fragile, marked with faint pencil impressions that had eluded earlier investigators. Under the scrutiny of high-resolution scanners and forensic light sources, the writing revealed itself, a note partial but suggestive that implied knowledge of circumstances surrounding Charlotte's disappearance. DNA technology, unavailable in 1961, was now applied to trace any potential connections. Hair samples, clothing fibers, and trace residues collected during the original investigation were re-examined with precision. Instruments capable of detecting what was invisible to the human eye. Each fragment, once inert, became a vector for discovery. The analysis uncovered minute traces that linked to a person of interest, a man whose proximity to Charlotte had always raised quiet suspicion but never produced evidence sufficient for charges. Digital reconstruction further clarified the last moments of her life. Using old photographs, maps, and witness statements, the detective created a timeline of June 14th that reconciled inconsistencies that had plagued the investigation for over 60 years. The faint footprint in the gravel near Maple Street, the alignment of shadows in photographs, and the fleeting glimpse of a dark-colored vehicle, all coalesced into a pattern that had gone unnoticed in the analog era. Each revelation carried weight beyond mere fact. The detective encountered the emotional resonance embedded in the artifacts, the journal pages pressed under glass, the pearl earrings stored in evidence, the faded photographs of Charlotte smiling in the sun, reminders that the woman at the center of the investigation was not merely a case file, but a life interrupted. He documented meticulously, aware that justice delayed did not lessen the human cost of years spent in uncertainty. As the forensic pieces assembled, new questions emerged. The suspect, long considered untouchable, had a life of routine and order, just as Charlotte did. The investigation illuminated patterns of movement, inconsistencies in alibis, and subtle behaviors previously dismissed as innocuous. Small betrayals surfaced, interactions recorded only in passing remarks by neighbors, fragments of recollection that gained clarity under modern cross-referencing. The suspect's psychological profile, constructed using contemporary methods, suggested a mind capable of controlling perception, manipulating trust, and navigating community suspicion with chilling effectiveness. The detective realized the emotional stakes were immense. This was not merely an exercise in procedural diligence. It was a chance to rewrite decades of grief into understanding, to offer closure that had been denied for over 60 years. Each discovery was tempered by the reality of lives already reshaped by absence. Charlotte's mother, now elderly, clung to hope even as memories of her daughter's last moments had become both vivid and painful over time. Friends and former neighbors, long resigned, were drawn back into the narrative, compelled to reconcile decades-old grief with the sharp edge of emerging truth. It was in the quiet hours, reviewing scanned images of her handwriting, examining photographs of her movements down Maple Street, that the detective felt the weight of responsibility. Each artifact, each faint trace of evidence, carried with it the echoes of Charlotte's internal life, the careful routines, the moments of hesitation, the small gestures that had once gone unnoticed. The case had become a dialogue across time, with the detective piecing together the puzzle left by a life abruptly suspended. By the end of the first month in this renewed investigation, the pattern was undeniable. The suspect's presence intersected with key moments in Charlotte's last known timeline. The forensic data, combined with witness reconstructions and archival analysis, established a chain of association previously invisible. What had been once dismissed as coincidence or ambiguity now formed the contours of something intentional, methodical, and tragically consequential. And yet, amid the technical clarity, the emotional weight remained. The detective often paused to consider the question haunting the entire case. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The question was no longer hypothetical, it was urgent. Answers were within reach, but they came entwined with decades of sorrow, community trauma, and the fragile hope of Charlotte's family finally confronting the truth. The breakthrough in Charlotte Marr's case did not arrive with the fanfare of revelation, but rather in the measured, deliberate unspooling of evidence that had waited silently for decades. Forensic reconstructions revealed the contours of the day she vanished with astonishing clarity. Shadows in old photographs aligned precisely with witness recollections. Footprints and soil samples, once overlooked, connected the suspect to locations Charlotte had passed. The accumulation of these subtle, persistent traces created a lattice of proof that could no longer be ignored. DNA analysis played a pivotal role. Hair fibers discovered in her work bag, untouched since 1961, were matched against the suspect, providing a concrete, indisputable link. Each laboratory test brought with it the cold, exacting authority of modern science, cutting through years of ambiguity and rumor. The laboratory technicians noted how remarkable it was that these traces had survived environmental degradation, carefully preserved, as if the case itself had been waiting for this moment. The suspect's psychological profile added depth to the investigation. Behavioral experts described someone capable of maintaining a facade of normalcy for decades, masking the tension of a hidden life. His interactions with neighbors and colleagues had always appeared unremarkable, but retrospective analysis revealed subtle patterns, small manipulations of perception, calculated misdirection, and an ability to control narratives without overt aggression. The persona he cultivated allowed him to coexist seamlessly with community suspicion while avoiding scrutiny. Investigators revisited the artifacts of Charlotte's life, each imbued with new significance. The journal, previously read as private reflections, now contained entries suggesting heightened anxiety in the days before her disappearance. Phrases once thought benign assumed urgent, foreboding meaning when examined in chronological context against movement patterns and witness reports. The pearl earring, stored in evidence for decades, was carefully documented under forensic lighting, revealing traces of materials consistent with the suspect's known environment. Even Charlotte's wardrobe offered insights. Fibers and microscopic residues suggested interactions with specific objects and spaces, aligning with forensic patterns already established. Investigators reconstructed her path through the morning of June 14th, mapping it with precision. The streets, the corner where she paused, the point at which she might have encountered the suspect. These reconstructions, painstaking in detail, created a narrative that wove together the fragments of memory, science, and observation. The revelations exposed more than the mechanics of the crime. They exposed its emotional weight. The calculated removal of Charlotte from the world she knew, the disruption of her routines, and the prolonged period in which the town existed in uncertainty revealed a cruelty that was both systemic and intimate. The investigation illuminated betrayal and complicity, not necessarily of others, but of circumstance, opportunity, and human oversight. Small errors decades ago, missed interviews, delayed searches, ambiguous observations magnified the emotional impact of her absence, extending grief and trauma far beyond the immediate family dot as the suspect's pattern emerged. Investigators also uncovered hints of deception beyond the disappearance itself, subtle falsifications of records, the erasure of minor details in early statements, and inconsistent accounts of his whereabouts. Each revelation compounded the sense of betrayal, showing a meticulous orchestration designed to evade detection. Yet in the midst of forensic and procedural clarity, the human story remained central. Charlotte's mother, now in the twilight of life, experienced a fragile combination of relief and sorrow. The past so pasty had shielded her from finality. Now, as the pieces fell into place, she faced the dual burden of truth and grief, the recognition of what had been lost and what could finally be acknowledged. Friends, neighbors, and former colleagues were drawn back into the emotional epicenter, revisiting memories once held in quiet silence. In these moments, investigators often confronted the starkest question of all: not what had been done, but why. The human motives behind the act, the psychological manipulation, and the prolonged concealment added layers of complexity, transforming the case from a simple disappearance into a study of character, power, and the fragility of trust. Charlotte's absence, once a static void, now reverberated with insight into the life that had been systematically controlled and extinguished. The pieces converged not as dramatic spectacle, but as the accumulation of subtle truths, each verified and cross-referenced. By the conclusion of this phase, the investigation team could see the contours of the full narrative: the premeditated planning, the manipulation of circumstance, the carefully hidden evidence, and the long arc of concealment. Each revelation carried its own emotional gravity, reminding everyone involved that this was no longer just a case study. It was the reconstruction of a life violently interrupted, and the beginning of its long-awaited reckoning. The culmination of decades of patience, science, and relentless scrutiny arrived quietly with the precision of inevitability. By the time the arrest was executed, Athens had already begun to feel the shift, the slow release of tension that had gripped the town for 64 years. Investigators moved with measured care, ensuring every step adhered to modern protocol. No sudden gestures, no dramatic confrontation. The suspect was taken into custody in the early morning hours, the pale light filtering through blinds, casting long shadows across the interior of his home. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, varnish, and faint tobacco smoke, a domestic environment that had long concealed a deeply unsettling truth. Evidence gathered over decades, now verified with contemporary methods, left no ambiguity. Fibers, trace materials, and DNA linked the man to Charlotte Moore's last known location. Historical records, once scattered and incomplete, aligned with new forensic reconstructions. Every uncertainty that had clouded the investigation since June 1961 had been systematically erased, replaced with a chain of proof that could withstand scrutiny in court. Athens reacted quietly at first. Neighbors and townspeople, long accustomed to the persistent ache of unresolved grief, processed the news in disbelief. The arrest was not a public spectacle. It was reported soberly, in the manner of procedural reality. Yet the emotional impact rippled outward. Friends of Charlotte, some of whom had long believed answers would never come, were drawn back into a liminal state between sorrow and relief. Her mother, who had carried the weight of uncertainty for decades, felt a mixture of validation, exhaustion, and the slow, dawning sense of closure she had never imagined possible. The suspect, once embedded seamlessly within the town's routines, now faced the full consequences of a life lived in calculated secrecy. Investigators revealed patterns of deception, manipulation, and concealment that had enabled him to evade suspicion for so long. Witnesses who had doubted their own memories were vindicated. Overlooked details now coalesced into a coherent narrative. The full arc of Charlotte's final hours, once obscured by the passage of time, became clear in reconstructed sequences that accounted for her movements, the suspect's proximity, and the subtle intersections of opportunity and intent. Community response was layered and profound. Local residents attended small gatherings at the courthouse steps, their voices hushed, conversations punctuated by recollections of a young woman who had quietly existed within their lives. The narrative of her absence, the uncertainty, the daily void was now complemented by the narrative of accountability. People spoke of her with renewed tenderness, emphasizing her gentleness, her soft-spoken nature, her unassuming kindness. The emotional landscape of Athens shifted, a slow reclamation of the collective memory that had been suspended for over 60 years. Investigators noted the long shadow cast by procedural missteps and early oversights, acknowledging that the cumulative effect of decades of delay had intensified the emotional stakes. Yet, in the quiet, clinical light of the evidence room, they also recognized the profound persistence of truth, that even when buried, even when ignored, it could not be extinguished. Charlotte Moore's life, though violently interrupted, had finally asserted itself through the work of meticulous inquiry, patient forensic science, and the unyielding persistence of memory. The final unraveling of the case did not erase the past. It reframed it. Every artifact, every photograph, every fragment of testimony collected across decades coalesced into a tapestry that was now fully legible. For Charlotte's mother, the neighbor who had glimpsed her silhouette, and the investigators who had labored across generations, there was a convergence of justice, closure, and enduring grief. The story had finally returned to the center, the woman herself, and allowed the community to acknowledge the depth of what had been lost and, finally, to honor it. Charlotte's presence, once erased from the streets of Athens, re-emerged in memory and in truth. The delicate, quiet life she had lived, and the violence that had interrupted it, could now be fully accounted for. The community could begin the long process of reclaiming its own narrative, intertwined as it had been with hers. The resolution of Charlotte Moore's case arrived not as a spectacle, but as a quiet, profound acknowledgment of a life disrupted and a town irrevocably shaped. With the suspect now in custody, evidence meticulously documented, and forensic confirmation in place, Athens, Ohio, finally faced the full dimensions of a truth that had lingered in shadow for 64 years. Charlotte's mother, long carrying the invisible weight of loss, could at last confront the reality with clarity. She walked through the Maple Street home, now empty in the way it had always felt without Charlotte, tracing the sunbeams across the floors and walls where her daughter once moved. Each room held echoes, the faint scent of polish and paper, the lingering warmth of her presence, the soft glow of morning light through lace curtains. But these echoes were now joined by the knowledge of what had truly transpired. The absence that had defined decades could finally be framed by understanding, a recognition that her daughter's life had been stolen, not merely lost. Community members, neighbors, and friends gathered in quiet remembrance. The town's ordinary routines once suspended in subtle anxiety, tempered by the unspoken fear of the unknown, shifted toward acknowledgement. Charlotte's life, once a series of private gestures and unremarkable days, was celebrated for its gentleness, its integrity, and its understated courage. Photographs of her smiling in sunlight, letters from friends, and personal items retrieved from storage were displayed in a local archive, not as evidence, but as tributes to a woman who had endured, if only briefly, in the consciousness of those around her. The emotional catharsis extended into the procedural realm. Investigators reflected on the meticulous application of modern forensic science and behavioral analysis, realizing that while justice had been delayed, persistence and methodical diligence had ultimately reclaimed what decades of absence could not erase. The forensic timeline, reconstructed with precision, allowed the community and Charlotte's family to understand her final movements, the orchestration of her disappearance. and the unbroken thread connecting her life to the eventual revelation of truth. Charlotte herself remained the emotional core. Her routines, her small habits, the private moments she had cherished, all were recast in light of the investigation's findings. Each journal entry, each photograph, each artifact became more than evidence. It became a testament to a life lived quietly, with care and attentiveness, and the violent rupture that had rendered it incomplete. The narrative that had once been suspended between speculation and sorrow now resolved into a coherent arc, allowing her presence to occupy its rightful space in the collective memory. For Athens, the case became a lesson in the endurance of memory and the persistence of truth. The years that had passed, though steeped in grief and uncertainty, had not erased the human desire for resolution. Citizens reflected on the fragility of perception, the importance of vigilance, and the necessity of community in both sustaining and honoring lives. Charlotte's story, once a cautionary tale of absence, now served as a testament to resilience, remembrance, and the eventual triumph of diligence over the inertia of time. Charlotte Moore's life, though marked by tragedy, reclaimed dignity through the acknowledgement of its contours, the routines, the hopes, the quiet longing for stability and safety. The town of Athens, the investigators, and her family collectively bore witness to the fullness of her existence, honoring her memory while confronting the uncomfortable truths her disappearance had exposed. Her mother, sitting at the kitchen table one late afternoon, sunlight spilling across the floral carpet, closed her eyes and felt a weight finally lift, however subtly. Charlotte's presence, once erased, was now indelibly imprinted on the town, her life remembered with clarity. Her story finally complete, Charlotte Moore would never return. But she could at last rest in the full acknowledgement of who she had been and what had been taken from her. The past, though long, had not defeated the truth. For more in-depth true crime stories and investigative journeys, subscribe and join us as we uncover the cases the world forgot but never stopped questioning.